Welcome back to Weekend Express. We're now shifting gears, taking a look at the education sector in the country. And in studio with me for this conversation, education expert Jonathan Wesaya, as well as Dr. Julius Juan, who is the director of the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development. Gentlemen, many thanks for joining us in studio. So a lot has been happening in the country in matters politics, and seemingly more important issues like health and education have pretty much taken the backstage. But let's focus on education for a moment, because just about last week, Education CS Fred Matiang'i came out to assure the country and assure parents really that the plan for free secondary education is still on with the scheduled plan of January 2018. Now, of course, many parents very happy about this, but the dynamics of how this is likely to work and the implementation are still rather hazy. So let me begin with you. Jonathan, in terms of the implementation, we have free secondary education, but we have a majority of our secondary schools being within the boarding school system as well. So what does it mean for parents when we talk about free secondary education? Will they not have to dig into their pockets at all to pay for anything in school?
Michelle, thank you for having me. I think it's a framing issue. And we lost it in 2003 when the government stated that we are going to have free primary education. The expectation on the public and the parents was so huge that parents refused literally to engage the education sector by way of making their direct contribution, because the pronouncement was political and it is free. We are making the same mistake going into 2018 by saying free secondary education. Rather, the Ministry of Education framed this as subsidized secondary education.
Right.
Because if you look at the rates, what we are having now that's obtaining in the schools is that the government is paying around 12,000 shillings for every student as tuition fees. They are increasing that by 10,000 shillings.
Right.
Less than 25,000 shillings cannot keep a child in secondary school for a year. We just need to get it right and call it by its name, that the government is going to subsidize secondary education so that the parents, guardians and caregivers know that they still need to make a direct contribution to the education of their children.
Right. Dr. John, then perhaps we'd have to compare this with the entire period of free primary education and whether that has worked as was initially envisioned.
Thank you for having me over. First of all, let me start from where he ended. That the worst mistake we make in this country is conceiving secondary education in the context of boarding schools.
Right.
And unfortunately, we are one of the very few countries in the world that conceive secondary education simply in the context of boarding schools. In countries where the government provides free secondary education, what the government does, one, is pay the teachers, provide for the laboratory equipments, what we call generally curriculum support materials, including books. And I think that is what the government is going to do.
Right.
And normally, because as I tell people, education and curriculum are as political, as technical as they can be. Once the government makes a pronouncement, then the technical people sit down, analyze the components that are going to be covered, then a circular is released. Because the cost of living is going up, the demands and requirements in schools are going up, and therefore increasing the amount that schools need to run free secondary education definitely has gone up. And that's what the government is trying to cover. I'm sure circular is going to come out and is going to clarify exactly which components and what amount of money is going to be given to each school.
Right.
The conception here is the confusion between boarding, which is an option, and what the government is supposed to provide in terms of free secondary education.
And I'm not so sure whether boarding schools are an option, when it comes to free primary education, even just in our overall education sector, because, like I went through the 844 system. You have to fill in which schools you want, and then depending on your marks and whichever school calls you, then you go to that school, and it could be a boarding school. And many of our students across the country are in boarding schools very far away from their homes. And so if you make it a day school and then you sort of create a confusion there. And the question has been as to whether we can then have these national schools and provincial schools in each constituency. So every child then can access these services properly. I don't know where the confusion comes in there with you, Jonathan.
We have tried so many things in education, and the problem in the sector has been we do not follow through. As my senior, Dr. Juan, he taught me.
Oh, really?
His student.
Rather interesting.
Is we begin and we do not follow particular strands and strains of thought in the sector, in the sense that our desire earlier on with the education reform beginning in 2003 was that we started with centers of excellence. The idea was regionally, let there be a school that other schools can look up to and do as that school does. But that thought was not carried through. Then we came in with the idea of expanding the national school footprint by elevating other what then were provincial schools into national status. Now, what is envisioned in the Constitution as it is now is that every child in Kenya is entitled to free quality basic education. Even if we were to make every school in Kenya a day school, and the government provides the teachers and curriculum support, as Dr. Juan is saying, still, we do not have enough space. So the 20,000 the ministry is anticipating to make as their contribution towards this support will not be enough because we don't have enough places. What literally needs to happen is we need to invest in the sector to a level where every primary school has a corresponding secondary school. So the transition is seamless. It is 100%. We are not at that level, and 20,000 shillings cannot literally carry that weight.
Jonathan has an important point, Dr.
Probably,
John.
I just need to clarify that from my understanding, the 20,000 we are talking about per child does not include the funds for infrastructure. If you're aware, like last year, the government allocated 5 billion outside that, which was specifically for improving infrastructure in schools so that they can enhance the capacity of secondary schools to accommodate more young people from primary schools. This year, 6 billion has been allocated for the same in this financial year. So the 20,000 that is being added per child is not including the funds that are meant to expand infrastructure in secondary schools to enhance access, because what the government is focusing on within the money that's allocating is the access, because we need 100% transition from primary to secondary. So the 20,000 per learner that goes to the school is different from the infrastructure funds.
Right. But as you rightly put it, free primary education definitely increased the transition rate from primary school to high school. And if we're not bringing the concept of free secondary education, then the transition rate there is likely to rise even higher from the current, I believe, 85%. Do we have enough infrastructure to accommodate all this? And if then we don't, is it a viable plan to promise parents that we will have free secondary education or subsidized secondary education by January 2018?
I would go for free secondary education and remove the component of boarding.
Right.
Because, as I said earlier, when you talk of conception of secondary education, because boarding in itself is very controversial. You'll go to one school and you find, for example, because of the kind of facilities they have, they charge a given maybe 20,000 for boarding. You go to another one, they charge 100,000 for boarding. So if you start synthesizing how much each school charges for boarding, depending even on the quality of food that they're providing, it gets very complicated. I doubt that that is part of the component that we have in free secondary education. But again, the circular, I'm sure, will come from the ministry that will clarify the components that are being covered, and if there are any components that are being left out, probably that will also be stated.
All right. Should we then, Jonathan, be speaking or having a conversation of only restricting boarding schools to the private schools, or the private sector, rather?
It's a wider discussion that we need to have as a country, as Dr. Juan is saying. In Kenya, the biggest problem is not with the government. It is with the individual parent the individual household. That we have been brought up and we are bringing up our children in a way that we run away from the parenting business and leave that to happen in school. That is why every parent is happy to take their 4- or 5-year-old into a boarding school, and the school will do it for them.
Right.
So that you blame another person. But his approach and what he is talking about, it would be cheaper for us as a country if then we had open discussion about this boarding business so that we try to dismantle it, make education cheaper, more accessible, focus on quality. Because as it is now, the government is grappling with access issues, and in the process, quality is dropping. Because it's difficult to juggle both. Because if it were in a laboratory, we would now be talking about how do we enhance the quality and the learning experience for these children who are getting into school. But the government, the resources are limited, they are strained, so it is, they can only deal with one side, which is the provision for access. And that is why it is easier for the government to say, we're going to introduce this subsidy for tuition.
Right.
But what we should not lose is the fact that every household in Kenya still must make their contribution to education. And that is going to come in via their contribution towards infrastructure and other levies that are going to be charged at the local level because they are contextual issues. If the wind blows off the roof of a classroom, the Ministry of Education is not going to have resources immediately to replace that roof. So as the Ministry of Education awaits allocation from Treasury, the community needs to act. But since 2003, because of how we frame this and say it is free, the parents are saying, no, but the government will deal with it. Right. It is the government.
Perhaps then we need to start defining what we expect, or what our parents expect when we tell them it's free primary education, and what the ministry means when they say free primary education. Even as you respond to this, Dr. Joan, some of the complaints coming in from not just parents, the parents' associations, and even heads of schools has been the late disbursement of resources to the free primary schools as is. And so when we're speaking of free secondary education, the disbursement or the late disbursement then is something that needs to be addressed. As a stakeholder, how would you suggest this be addressed?
I think before we come to that, allow me to address the issue of the money. Because I think we are aware that immediately, I think that was about 1 month ago, the cabinet approved 25 billion shillings to address the issue of free secondary education. And that means technically money is already being allocated for that process, so that we don't wait until the schools open and then the money is made available. And then I think we also, as I said earlier, we also need to separate the money that is going to improve quality, which goes to schools to buy equipment, improve the infrastructure, etc., etc. I mean, improve the learning materials, and the money that is being given separately to enhance infrastructure in specific schools, to enhance capacity for accommodation. So on the one hand, the government is trying to deal with the issue of quality. And when you talk of quality, you're talking about the recruitment of teachers, you're talking about the improvement of learning support materials. And you've also seen that the government is also expanding the provision of textbooks to schools to address the issue of quality. Then on the other hand, we have the 5 billion, and this year the 6 billion that's being allocated to improve infrastructure to enhance access. So you can see that the government is struggling in its, in the best way that it can to address both at the same time. And so it can never be perfect, but in my view, I think it cannot be taken for granted. I think it's a move in the right direction, and it's something that requires. Now, coming back to your question, and before I come to your question, another thing that I think probably we could be jumping the gun about. Once a declaration is made, the technical people go and sit down, they synthesize the amount of money that is available, then a circular is released that indicates to the schools, this is meant for this is meant for this is meant for this. So this discussion is good, but more or less preemptive. Once the circular comes out, then we can now discuss the substance of the matter. This is the amount of money available. We said 25 billion. How is it going to address the various components of learning in school? Then now we can say, this one has been given less money, this one requires more money. I think our debate then would be more informative, because now it's more speculative of what is likely to happen. I think the issue of disbursement is more of a treasury and the KRA, and how this is done, of course, plus the ministry. I'm not sure that I would delve deep into that, because there could be technicalities, because I don't think it only happens to the Ministry of Education and schools for that matter. And I'm sure if you look at the infrastructure that schools require, the equipments and the books, etc., schools can do their planning in such a manner that even if the funds delay, it does not disrupt the learning, because the teachers are there, the equipments are simply being improved, and the schools have been in existence.
Right.
So it doesn't mean that if money comes late, that anything comes to a standstill. But I know that is a concern that everybody would definitely want to be sorted out.
All right. Osaya, your thoughts on this, even as we try to define whether this is free secondary education or subsidized secondary education, because how much sense does it make to tell somebody entry is free, entry into our KTM studios is free, but you have to pay for where you're going to sit. So again, are we drawing the line here? Is it free secondary education or is it subsidized secondary education? And in terms of allocation, the education sector has been pretty much one of the highly funded sectors in the country. Would you feel that that is appropriate, the current allocation that we have, or should we be speaking of more allocations then to facilitate the plans that we have as a country?
I'll not speak of more allocation for the education sector before we try to extract value from the current allocation.
Right.
As it is now, there is a lot of what I'll call system capture, in the sense that the allocation, most of it is remaining within Jogo House to facilitate operations and payment of teacher salaries. So there is a lot of recurrent expenditure within the system and not development expenditure that then would take the sector to the next level.
Right.
This is a function of a structure that is not very effective, as it were. But then we are changing the system and not changing the structure that is supporting it. Many of the functions of the Ministry of Education in terms of field support at the point of service delivery are not supported well because the resources are limited. Dr. Joan will tell you that where he sits in the Institute of Curriculum Development, they are strained even in piloting what they have as a curriculum in all the schools, and they have to pilot here and there because of the limit of the resources that he has control over.
All right.
But as a country, looking at the budget allocation, the Ministry of Education is largely obtaining the largest share of the national cake. So it is a discussion that we need to engage on going forward to see what will be an optimal level approach for us to get a maximum return from the investment we are making in the education sector.
Right.
But as it is now, the World Bank just released a report on the promise of learning, and it is saying that our children are in school, but they are not learning.
They're not learning.
Our teachers are not doing well enough.
All right, and that's a good point to take a break, because I know it's take a break, but when we come back, we'll continue with this conversation, because also set to be implemented in January 2018 is a new education curriculum 2633. But as we speak, a local university lecturer has moved to the Mombasa High Court seeking a suspension of these orders. He has also sued not just the Ministry of Education, but the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development, saying the new education curriculum is not right for Kenyan students just yet. We'll be having this conversation after this short break. We'll also be opening our phone lines to parents and students alike, as well as education stakeholders to give in their thoughts as to this new education curriculum. This is Weekend Express. More coming up after the break.